Berlin was in flames, the Reich was collapsing, and inside the bunker, Nazi leaders faced their final moments, some choosing suicide, others capture, and a few a desperate escape into the ruins. If you value documented World War II history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also, comment from which city you're hearing this from. Now back to the story. With the city crumbling outside, every decision could mean life or death. Berlin was a city under siege, smoke curled above shattered rooftops. Artillery fire rattled the streets, and the air was thick with dust, fear, and the stench of destruction. Inside the bunker, Nazi leaders paced and whispered, their faces pale under flickering electric lights. Maps were spread across tables, ink smudged from frantic hands, showing lines of retreat that no longer existed. Every corridor carried the echoes of past authority, now replaced by uncertainty and mounting panic. Hitler's closest aides moved hurriedly between rooms, conveying fragmented intelligence about the approaching Red Army. Reports were contradictory, sometimes delayed, sometimes alarmingly precise. Each messenger arrived with news that pushed anxiety higher, and every decision required weighing impossible choices: stay or flee, fight or surrender, obedience or self-preservation. Leaders who once commanded millions now grappled with the harsh immediacy of survival, their training in strategy and intimidation suddenly eclipsed by the relentless advance of enemy forces. In the upper floors of the bunker, generals and SS officers argued in tense whispers. Some insisted that holding the city at all costs was a final testament to duty and honor, while others questioned the feasibility of any defense strategy. The psychological strain was apparent. Decades of indoctrination collided with stark reality. Those trained to believe in invincibility now faced imminent annihilation. Each man's conscience, every personal fear, and the shared dread of accountability intersected in the claustrophobic confines of reinforced concrete walls. Supplies dwindled, food was scarce, and ammunition had become a precious commodity. The radio crackled sporadically, sending fragmented updates from distant command posts that could no longer influence events. Leaders contemplated their options while weighing the lives of soldiers, civilians, and their own families. Anxiety was compounded by the knowledge that the world outside no longer adhered to their authority. The Allies were advancing, and the Soviets approached from the east, relentless and merciless. Fear sharpened every decision, made every choice a moral and strategic gamble. Psychological tension heightened with each passing hour. The constant noise of bombardment, the occasional scream from the streets above, and the unsettling quiet in the inner chambers of the bunker combined to create a suffocating atmosphere. Leaders, once pillars of calculated power, were now prisoners of circumstance, their minds racing to predict outcomes that were beyond control. History had turned against them, and every heartbeat was a reminder of impending defeat. The walls themselves seemed to close in, reinforcing the gravity of their situation. For viewers, this scene immerses them in the human drama of the Third Reich's final hours. Suspense builds naturally as the audience anticipates which choices will be made, who will survive, and how personal and ideological convictions will clash with the unforgiving reality of war. The tension, fear, and high stakes create an intimate connection with historical figures, blending moral contemplation with visceral engagement. Each moment is weighted with anticipation, forcing the audience to reckon with the fragility of power and the psychological burden of leaders in collapse. Berlin was falling, and inside the bunker, the last decisions of a doomed regime were unfolding in real time. The walls reverberated with fear, strategy, and unspoken regret. Outside, the Red Army advanced relentlessly, oblivious to the inner turmoil. Every second brought leaders closer to confrontation, to surrender, or to death. The city crumbled, and the human mind strained to match the chaos surrounding it, setting the stage for the irreversible conclusion of a dark chapter in history. Each order carried consequences for thousands, yet the clock ran faster toward annihilation. Inside the bunker, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Leaders moved between tables and maps, their gestures sharp, voices clipped with urgency. Every command they issued was weighed not only against military necessity, but also the creeping realization that their empire was collapsing around them. Orders to hold positions, evacuate units, or redirect resources carried an almost cruel duality, the semblance of control against the inevitability of defeat. Generals and adjutants worked in rapid succession, transmitting fragmented instructions to units scattered across Berlin. Some directives were coherent, others barely made sense, a symptom of confusion and desperation. Each message contained the weight of life or death, thousands of soldiers, civilians, and the fate of families depended on choices made in this underground labyrinth. Viewers are drawn into the immediacy of these high-stakes decisions. The juxtaposition of authority and vulnerability, creating an almost cinematic suspense, in private corners of the bunker. Hitler's closest advisors debated the morality and feasibility of last-ditch measures. Some advocated for continuing the fight to the bitter end, clinging to ideological dogma. Others recognized the futility and urged strategic withdrawal or surrender. The psychological strain was immense. These men had spent years exerting control, instilling fear, and commanding obedience, yet now, surrounded by concrete walls and imminent collapse, they faced the ultimate test of human judgment under pressure. Suspense builds as the audience witnesses these figures confront their own fallibility. Orders were sometimes contradictory. Communications with outer units were sporadic, distorted by bombardment and chaos. The urgency of action collided with the impossibility of coordination. Messages sent minutes apart could result in catastrophic misunderstandings, inadvertently endangering those the leaders aimed to protect. The audience feels the fragility of power every decision reverberates, amplifying tension and highlighting the stark moral dilemmas of leadership and extremists. As each moment passed, leaders grappled with the personal consequences of their commands. Choosing to fight meant more lives lost. Choosing surrender risked dishonor, retribution, or immediate death at the hands of advancing forces. The contrast between authority and vulnerability became painfully clear. Those once revered for their decision-making now faced the raw terror of impotence. Viewers are immersed in both the historical narrative and the human psychology, behind the final actions anticipating outcomes while questioning the morality and logic of the choices made. The Red Army's approach intensified every minute, underscoring the futility of even the most calculated orders. The bunker's corridors, once echoing with confidence, were now filled with hurried footsteps, anxious whispers, and the palpable weight of desperation. Viewers are gripped by suspense, curiosity, and empathy, connecting with the men tasked with decisions that could alter history in real time. Ultimately, this section captures the convergence of chaos, morality, and responsibility. Orders, once symbols of power, now highlight vulnerability and the human cost of leadership under collapse. The tension, moral ambiguity, and looming consequences maintain audience engagement, preparing them for the inevitable reckoning that follows in the final hours of Berlin. Every second matters. Every choice shapes the narrative of history and the human experience at the edge of annihilation. Even as the world outside fell, some clung desperately to the lives they loved. Inside the dimly lit corridors of Berlin's collapsing leadership compounds, Nazi officials moved with quiet urgency, not only planning last-minute directives, but also attempting to safeguard the fragile threads of family and trusted aides. The air was heavy with fear, smoke, and the distant rumble of artillery, each vibration a reminder of the encroaching Red Army and the inevitable end of their reign. For viewers, this setting immediately establishes tension, empathy, and curiosity about the personal stakes that intersected with historical events. Leaders weighed every action carefully. Some prioritized the safety of spouses, children, or siblings, issuing instructions to aides for the hurried relocation or concealment of family members. The moral landscape was fraught. Their devotion to ideology and country clashed with instinctive protective impulses. Did they risk exposure of strategic information to safeguard loved ones, or abandon personal safety for adherence to orders? The audience is drawn into these ethical quandaries, pondering the complex interplay of duty, love, and survival in extreme circumstances. Interactions with staff were equally intense. Aides, secretaries, and bodyguards became intermediaries in a web of tension, relaying orders, organizing transport, and making life-and-death decisions with limited information. Trust was both a necessity and a gamble. One misstep could lead to exposure, capture, or death. The suspense for the audience stems from this precarious balance. How far would loyalty extend, and at what cost? Viewers are invited to visualize these tense exchanges, imagining the whispered conversations, hurried footfalls, and silent calculations in the bunker's shadowed corners. The psychological toll on leaders was profound, as they moved between the task of defending strategic positions and attending to the immediate welfare of loved ones. Inner conflicts emerged. Anxiety, fear, and guilt were interwoven with determination, producing a complex emotional tableau. Audiences experienced the human side of historical figures, often reduced to names and positions. The section creates empathy while maintaining suspense through the looming threat of death and capture. Each decision carried profound consequences, amplifying tension and engagement. Amid chaos, small acts of protection offered fleeting hope. One aide might hide a child beneath rubble. Another might negotiate passage through collapsing streets. And leaders sometimes concealed valuables or sensitive documents that, if found, could endanger their family. These seemingly minor decisions acquire monumental weight in context, emphasizing the human struggle for survival and care amid systemic collapse. Suspense builds as viewers contemplate the fragility of life and the moral calculus required in these final hours. Ultimately, this section illustrates the collision of personal loyalty, ethical compromise, and historical catastrophe. The juxtaposition of intimate concern against the backdrop of Berlin's destruction creates emotional resonance and moral tension. Audiences are left reflecting on what choices they might make under similar pressures, while curiosity about outcomes is sustained. Each moment in these final hours reinforces the complexity of human behavior in extremis, providing immersive engagement that blends history, psychology, and suspense. Truths emerged in whispers, and loyalty faltered under the weight of impending defeat. As Berlin's last hours drew near, the bunker corridors became a crucible of tension, where ideology, fear, and self-preservation collided. Nazi leaders confronted the reality of collapse, not just the disintegration of the Reich, but also the moral and psychological strain within their inner circles. Viewers are immediately drawn into the emotional pressure, curious about human behavior when loyalty is tested against impending doom. Conversations between leaders and their aides often oscillated between strategic planning and confessional outpourings. Some officers admitted doubts, acknowledged failures, or revealed regrets in hushed tones, seeking reassurance or understanding. The audience experiences suspense and moral complexity as these private moments peel back layers of ideology to expose vulnerability. Humanizing figures often remembered solely for power and cruelty. Every whispered admission becomes a window into psychological unraveling, amplifying curiosity about how individuals reconcile ideology with reality. Ideological justifications frequently clashed with emerging fears. Leaders attempted to rationalize past actions, citing duty, obedience, or historical inevitability, while aides and confidants silently or openly challenged these rationalizations. This tension highlights cracks in loyalty, forcing viewers to witness the erosion of rigid hierarchies. The audience becomes a silent observer of trust and betrayal, intrigued by the interplay of fear, guilt, and self-interest in extreme circumstances. Stress responses manifested in subtle yet dramatic ways. Pacing, abrupt commands, hushed arguments, or long silences filled with unspoken tension. These micro-behaviors offered glimpses into internal struggle, creating suspense that mirrors real-time anxiety for the viewer. Every pause, glance, or trembling hand becomes a storytelling device, immersing audiences in the psychological atmosphere of the bunker. Emotional engagement deepens as viewers connect empathy with anticipation, wondering which confessions will emerge, which loyalties will hold, and which relationships will fracture under pressure. Confession sometimes included admissions of complicity, concealed knowledge of atrocities, or acknowledgement of fears for personal survival. Each disclosure carried ethical weight, presenting audiences with moral dilemmas and prompting reflection. Could human conscience persist under absolute authority? The interplay between confession and silence fuels curiosity, compelling viewers to anticipate the ripple effects of revealed truths on decisions, trust, and behavior within the bunker. The section culminates in a palpable sense of psychological unraveling. The combination of ideological collapse, imminent defeat, and interpersonal conflict demonstrates the human cost of fanaticism and the fragility of loyalty when confronted with reality. Viewers are left engaged, emotionally stirred, and intellectually stimulated as they process both the historical consequences and the universal truths about fear, morality, and interpersonal dynamics under extreme stress. Ultimately, Conflict and Confession highlights the moral and psychological pressure on individuals who once wielded authority without accountability. Suspense, ethical tension, and historical immersion merge, ensuring that the audience remains captivated while reflecting on the complex interplay between ideology, conscience, and human behavior at the edge of catastrophe. The walls closed in, and every choice echoed with finality. Berlin was a city in ruins, smoke curling from bombed-out buildings, the distant rumble of artillery shaking the shattered streets. Within the subterranean corridors of the Vorbunker, Nazi leaders faced the culmination of their decisions and the collapse of everything they had built. Fear, desperation, and the weight of historical consequence filled every corner. For viewers, suspense is immediate. They witness individuals confronting both personal mortality and the broader failure of a regime. Leaders moved with calculated urgency, issuing last orders, coordinating what remained of their forces, or attempting to secure escape routes. Some reflected on their role in shaping history, a stark contrast to the chaos around them. The audience becomes privy to the internal struggle between rational thought and the paralyzing realization of imminent defeat. Each decision, whether to flee, surrender, or cling to ideology, carries immense moral and physical stakes, drawing viewers into the tension of final moments. Fear and desperation manifested in tangible ways. Shouts echoed down narrow hallways. Hurried footsteps and whispered commands punctuated the oppressive atmosphere. Leaders argued over priorities, debated risk, and struggled to maintain composure. Every glance toward an exit, every cautious step through rubble-laden passages, heightened suspense. Viewers are immersed in a scenario where historical knowledge amplifies tension. They know what awaits outside, yet they experience the immediacy and uncertainty of those final minutes. Some leaders faced personal reflection, confronting choices made years prior, acts of cruelty, loyalty, or complicity. Diaries, notes, and whispered admissions reveal a spectrum of emotion: defiance, regret, fear, and resignation. These intimate glimpses humanize figures often remembered solely for ideology or authority, prompting viewers to consider ethical questions under extreme duress. Emotional engagement deepens as audiences grapple with the tension between historical judgment and individual psychology. Interplay between action and reflection intensified as Allied and Soviet forces closed in. Leaders navigated the physical dangers of collapse-blocked exits, incoming fire, and disoriented subordinates, while also wrestling with internal dilemmas. The audience experiences dual suspense: the immediate peril and the moral reckoning inherent in final decisions. Every choice is laden with consequence, making each movement and interaction crucial to understanding both human behavior and historical outcome. As Berlin's collapse became inescapable, the inevitability of capture, death, or final surrender loomed. For viewers, the narrative conveys a sense of inexorability, combining historical facts with psychological immersion. The audience remains captivated, anticipating which figures will act decisively, which will falter, and how history will record their fates. The tension between fear, duty, and self-preservation sustains engagement, encouraging reflection on leadership, morality, and human resilience in extremis. Ultimately, confronting the end merges suspense, historical accuracy, and psychological insight. Viewers are drawn into the claustrophobic intensity of Berlin's last hour, experiencing the convergence of human frailty, moral complexity, and historical consequence. Curiosity, empathy, and reflection are maintained, setting the stage for the final resolution of individual fates. In the next section, history witnessed the last acts of power, now reduced to final breaths and uncertain legacies. As Berlin crumbled, Nazi leaders faced the consequences of their choices. Some, unable to confront the reality of defeat and the moral weight of their actions, chose suicide. The most prominent among them, including figures who had once dictated orders affecting millions, ended their lives quietly in the bunker's shadowed chambers or hastily arranged locations, leaving behind documents, personal effects, and lingering questions of accountability. Viewers are immediately drawn into tension and contemplation, understanding the gravity of these final moments. Others were captured by the encroaching Allied and Soviet forces. The process of apprehension was swift and deliberate. Soldiers meticulously secured each leader, cataloged their possessions, and began the preliminary stages of interrogation and detention. The audience experiences suspense, as the balance of power shifted completely from omnipotent authority to complete vulnerability. The stark reversal highlights not only historical consequence, but also the fragility of human control in the face of inevitable collapse. The fates of escapees added further intrigue. A few managed to flee the city, navigating destroyed streets and avoiding patrols, only to face eventual capture or life in hiding. These stories sustain curiosity, demonstrating human ingenuity and desperation under extreme conditions. For viewers, the uncertainty of survival, juxtaposed with the certainty of historical reckoning, reinforces both suspense and engagement. Each narrative thread, the suicide, the capture, the evasion, offers different perspectives on accountability, responsibility, and moral consequence beyond the immediate outcomes. The aftermath of these final hours shaped historical memory. The documents recovered, testimonies of witnesses, and later historical analyses contributed to a fuller understanding of the regime's collapse. Families, historians, and survivors recorded and preserved accounts of both action and inaction, creating a complex picture of human behavior at the extremes of ideology and fear. Audiences are encouraged to reflect on these broader implications, considering how individual choices ripple through history, influencing both scholarly interpretation and collective memory. Emotional engagement deepens as the personal costs of power and ideology become evident. For viewers, it is not just the historical facts that captivate, but the human consequences: fear, courage, denial, and resignation. The narrative juxtaposes acts of final defiance with acts of despair, highlighting ethical tension and human complexity. Each leader's end carries lessons about responsibility, obedience, and the consequences of wielding power without accountability. Ultimately, death, surrender, and legacy provides resolution while leaving lingering reflection. Viewers are guided through the immediate outcomes, from death to capture, and into the lasting historical significance. Suspense and curiosity remain intact, but are now paired with ethical and emotional contemplation. The section bridges historical narrative with moral inquiry, ensuring audiences are both informed and introspectively engaged, considering not only what occurred, but the enduring lessons on leadership, ideology, and human choice.